All right, good people. We're gonna get right into it. So yeah, last session we were starting to talk a little bit about state. So we got really deep into a particular app that we were building, and I kind of brought up a pretty interesting scenario that came up with regards to us wanting to um, manipulate some data, right? And then from there, we kind of realized like, oh, we need to kind of learn about a different type of topic in order to make some changes, right? To make things happen with the data. And so we're going to continue that conversation and talk more about state and React. Go over some of what we talked about last class, and just make sure that we kind of are aware of like what the valuable, why is state important and what is it allowing us to do. So I just had the browser and then it had the browser and then the browser disappeared. So give me 1 second to pull that back up. Don't know why it did me like that. All right, bet. Cool. So little application we worked on last session was all about kind of making an application that was interactable, but also updatable, right? And was updating the data based on the interactions. And so we built this nice little counter application that was able to update some text based on actions happening on the DOM, right? So as this button is getting clicked, clearly we're able to make some changes to the value of the data here. So let's just take a look back at how we're achieving this and talk about the concept one more time. So taking a look at the code, we have this add one component, which is really just a component that is responsible for showing some a nice heading message, giving us the button, and then the button being responsible for doing the data updates that are necessary. And so we started talking about a pretty interesting concept in React called state. And I showed y'all 2 ways of using state, one in a functional component, which is by way of the use state hook, which is basically it's like a pretty sophisticated function that is built into the React library. And you can use the use state hook in order to create state on a functional component. The whole point of creating state is so that you can create a value that can update over time. And when this value updates, it will cause your React application to re-render or to basically refresh the screen of React elements without actually refreshing the browser. So state is a really important concept in React because state is the type of data that you add to a component that when you want the component to update the data over time, right? What we were talking about last class that was the kind of precursor to this was the fact that props, right? If I were to give this component a prop, and let's just say test, and I'm gonna give it let's just give it a string and say, this is constant. So I'll pass this prop into the add one component called test. I'm gonna save this real quick to show y'all. But so if I were to come back to this component and with a functional component, say I want to use props and mess around with this, and then I want to do something like props.test, and I want to set this equal to change this. Right. So this would be like what you would expect to do if you wanted to update, the prop or something, right? Before I do this though, let me just console log props.test so y'all see that it is passing that value. So I'm gonna save this and then open the whoops. What are you talking about? Oh, my bad, y'all. My bad. That's my bad. I gotta comment this out. Y'all saw how I got like visibly upset at the fact that I got an error. That's what it means to be a technologist. I was like, wait a second, nah, not right now, nah. I'm teaching. But so you see that when we open the inspector and go back to the console, right? We see that value. This is constant that is coming back from the prop. So remember, I set that prop in here. So props we pass from parent to child. And so I gave this prop called test and I gave it its value. So when we called props in the functional component, right, it's coming back with the right value. But if I go to the next line and I try to change the prop, right, so I try to give props.test something, a different string, let's see what happens here, right? Oh, well, that's an error I expected to happen, which is why I ain't freaking out. But cannot assign to read-only property test of object, blah, 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 right? So this is the error that you're going to get if you start trying to change props. Clearly, your whole application is going to mess up. And that's because props are constant values. So you can't update them, right? When you want data that's inside of a component already, but you want to change it, right? You have to use state. That is the difference between props and state. Props, you can pass from component to component, but a component can't change its props. So you have to, if you want the data to change, you have to use state in order to have a value that is able to be updated by the component in from within itself, right? I can change the prop, but in order to change the prop, I have to change it here. That's where this prop changes. If I want that prop to change, I have to change it here. Otherwise, inside of the component, when it's received it's already too late. So state is a mutable piece of data in React. You can use it to make changes. And we talked not only about functional components and the way that functional components define state, using the use state hook. We also talked about the way that classes also can define state, right? And so in a class-based component, the way that the concept is the same, but the way in which you define it is definitely very different. So in a class-based component, state is already built into it, right? So you can use state. You can use state in a class-based component just by defining this dot state in the constructor. So classes have a set of functions that are predefined inside of them. So constructor and the render function are the two functions that two of the functions that classes have predefined. Classes use the constructor, like any class in any programming language uses a constructor to run some specific initialization functions. So the React component is its own class, and we get the ability to overwrite the render and constructor function by passing whatever we want to pass inside of there. So what we call super props, we're basically just initializing the React component class with props as well. And then we are able to then do what we want to do, initializing our component. So we can use this.state and we can add different values and different values to the state, right? So I was showing y'all if we wanted to add different values, we could do something like this and have all the values that we want to have inside of the state defined. And then classes also use a render function, unlike functions that kind of just return. So in the render function, that's when you can make use of the state. So you'll see this dot state and is how you refer to the state object. And you can call this dot state dot whatever to get the value back from the state object. And so so here, that's what we're doing. Same thing we were doing in the functional component, just a different syntax, this dot state dot number. But really what this button was responsible for was we talked about event handling. And so buttons and other objects have specific events that they can send scripts to. And so buttons have an on-click event that you can call that essentially whenever the button gets clicked, it's going to call some function. So here we defined a function, and this function is responsible for setting up what happens when the user clicks, right? So here, clearly all we're doing is getting a variable that represents the old state, or the current state, I should say. And then we are updating that by 1 and then resetting the state. So in a class-based component, the most important things to know about using state, we define it in the constructor. You refer to it with the this.state preface, like those keywords, this.state. And then when you want to finally update the state, you call the function this.setState with the new state. And here, whenever I'm calling this.setState, I can make this as different as I want to be. It's not like just because of a key and a value don't exist when I first make the state, doesn't mean that when I call this.setState later, I can't just create a new key and new value. So that state is very flexible in that sense. But yeah, so the whole purpose of me showing you this was because at the end of the day, right, there's going to be mad times where you're going to need your component to know about data that's changing inside of it and saving that data over time so that it can it can use that information to change how the UI is being shown, right? Most times we use state in a way that will allow us to do something unique with it in the rest of the React component, which undoubtedly is going to change up how we do the rendering, what we render, what visual components and elements will people see. So let's just extend this real quick, right? And just for the sake of kind of seeing another example. But Eric, go ahead.
I have 2 questions really quick. First of all, what was the reason that we have user state 0 in
the functional component?
Yeah. What was the
So
reason
yeah. So in a class-based component, right? Whenever you set the state, you normally give that value. You have to give it a value, right? So you define the key and you give it a value. So in the regular state, you always are defining what the state is whenever you declare something. In a functional component, you have to do the same thing, in that the function is responsible for setting up the state. And so basically, if you're going to use the use state hook and do it as a functional component, you have to set up what the key is for you. Like if you think about it like as if it was an object, this would be the key, this would be the value, the initial value, and this would be the function that you call to change the key.
Okay, so whatever I want to initialize the key, I just pass it through the user state, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if I wanted another set of states in this format, maybe it was is correct, right? And then set is correct. And then I could have this be false, right? Or whatever I want to pass as data. So this can be number, string, Boolean, object, array, whatever it needs to be. Does that make sense?
Yes. And the other question I wanted to ask you, and all of these that we're doing, like for example, the bottom, all of these we can assign like a class or an ID or something to be able to style it, right?
Yeah. So if I wanted to style any of this, right? So right now, if you look at the elements, so like the div that we have for our component is this div right here, right? So if I were to add a class name, so in React, you don't just call class, you say class name. If I wanted to style this, I could give this a particular class name. So let's say add one, and then inside of here, you'll see that the div will update with that particular class. So now you know, okay, this is this div, right? That we're talking about. So if I wanted to style just that div, then I could target add one and add, add styles to it, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, right, whatever I wanted to do stylistically, right? But the goal is that if you want to style elements, you're going to want to give them specific class names, and then you want to import a CSS file that has those styles defined. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. Thank you, Professor.
I'm sorry, ambulances and stuff passing by. So yeah, it's going to be up to you to determine whether or not you are the person that you want to use the use state hook and do this in a function component context, or if you want to go the classic route and use a class-based component. Each have their pros and cons, I guess, right? Functional components, the pro is that it's a little shorter, right? But the con is every time you need to make a new state, you have to write this use state kind of syntax over and over again. Classes, the pro is that, state gets defined, and then you can define as many properties in one place as you want. You don't have to keep making a new function. We just use set state. It's the same function for all of them. And at the end of the day, so classes also have other methods that you can use beyond the constructor and render that make it easier to understand when a component is going to change based on changes in state, changes in props and stuff like that a function component also doesn't have pre-built. The downside of a class clearly is, it is a little bit more code in terms of what you have to write to get things out of the box. You got to define these other functions, and then when you're referring to stuff, you have to use the this dot blah 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 syntax to get things kind of across. So it is kind of the kind of thing that can become a little bit it's really subjective, and so I wanted to make sure that what state does, right? And we use state really to hold value that is going to be updated by internally from a component. But also understand that there's two ways that we can start defining that, whether we're using a class or whether we're using a function. So if that point makes sense, just like understanding state, understanding why we would use it, and the fact that there's these two different ways to use it, just give me a thumbs up in the Zoom right now so I can just make sure that we're all on the same page. Nice. Cool, thank you. Any other questions before we move on? Cool. All right. So let's just do another example of how we would use state in a practical context. And so, I'm going to leave the add one component kind of as it is. So it's a class-based component for right now. And I'm going to just let's just say instead of just adding one, we also want another button that will let us decrease by one, right? So how would I do that, right? Well, first thing is I might want that extra button. So that's whenever I'm thinking about something else visually I need to see or I want to see, that's a JSX thing. So I just need some JSX to define that other button. So we have the H1, we have the first button. And so I might want to just copy this. Actually, I'll just do it from scratch so it's easier to learn. So do the button. Inside, so a button is a nested element. So you kind of open a tag and you close a tag, and then inside, in between the tag, you can just put you can put the text that you want the button to show. All right, and then buttons take a specific parameter called onClick that you use to basically define a function that this button is going to call whenever it gets clicked. But So just for right now, I'm just gonna put an empty arrow function that just kind of alerts us whenever the button gets clicked. So I'm gonna save this, and I expect to see, okay, so we got a -1, and when I click it, we got a little alert popping up. So we know that that's wired up. And now we just need to make sure that this function, this arrow function that we have defined here, actually does what we need it to do, right? So we already have some state. We have this .state.number that's already kind of set up in here in the class. So all I really want to do is decrease the value in state by 1, right? So I want to get a reference to this .state, right? So this .state.number is the value in the state for the number right now. So I'm going to say let num get this .state.number, and then in the next line I'm going to say num gets num -1, right? And then now that I want to set the state, I want to do this dot set state, and then I always got to pass an object. So in a class-based context, state is an object always. So I want to say put this empty object to start, and then I got to just choose what's the key and values that I want to put in the new state. And so clearly I want the same key because I want this to stay consistent. So I'm gonna say number, and I'm gonna set it equal to num, right? So now all we did was take the original number, subtract it by 1 in a temporary variable, and then set the state with that new variable, right? So now we can update by 1, and we can decrease by 1, and it'll keep going however much that we want it to go. And so yeah, working with state is really important because of the fact that there's always going to be moments where you're going to need to make specific changes to data, and those changes are going to need to be preserved by the component. And when you want those changes both preserved by the component and then ultimately saved in a saved later for the component to draw back to, you're going to want to save it in state, right? We talked about at the beginning, you might think it's as simple as just keeping a variable and changing the variable, but the problem is just updating a variable isn't going to update the UI. If you want the UI to update with a change that's going on, you have to use some type of state to update. So yeah, quick pulse check. Does everything making sense? This new little thing we added with the set state and whatnot. Thank y'all. See some thumbs up there. Appreciate it. So I just got a quick question for y'all. Just out of curiosity, I tried to ask this at the end of our last session, but which do you think is easier to understand? The hooks in the function or the class and the regular kind of state, this state stuff in the class? Classes. I see a lot of class. All right, well, that's good to know. Some folks saying functions. Makes sense. Word. Okay, so yeah, it makes sense. It's each of them are kind of different, right? But they do similar things. The structure of the syntax is what you got to kind of get used to. So for the most part, I'm gonna for the most part use classes, but I want y'all to know that if you personally want to restructure what I'm doing from classes into functions and use hooks, that's totally cool. It just is a little bit more different with state and some other principles that we'll talk about, but I'll try to do my best to show y'all always the context of what we're doing with the class and how it might apply if we were doing this as a function. So I'm going to just cut this for now and just bring it to the bottom here, actually. All right, cool. Awesome. So we got our nice little add one component, and we kind of learned a little bit more about state in the process. So now I want to kind of go back to talking about another element that's really important to understand in the web dev context, and talk about how we use that element with relationship to this conversation about preserving information in state and whatnot. And so what I want to do first is kind of just reset like kind of what's going on in the application. I built this add one component just as a test so we can learn a little bit about state. So what I'm going to do is just kind of go back to the original kind of app that we were working with, and talk a little bit more about state in the context of like these practical applications. So if you remember what we were talking about before, we built an application that was kind of sophisticated in that it has a table and we have like a form, right? And this form is responsible for what we want this form to do is basically take this data that it has in here and to add it to this table, right? And the whole idea of how this was built, we built this table component that was responsible for essentially having like getting some data in as props, and the data that it got as props, it did this really interesting like mapping function over it, where we took all the data from props, and then basically the table body is built dynamically. So based on however many data points are in here, it'll just build however many React elements it needs. So we don't have to specify that ourselves. And the table header is just a table header, just showing the top of the table, right? And then we started talking about this other component called a form, right? And in the form component, we started talking about like form elements and the fact that a form is a pretty important JavaScript, HTML element that is also very important in the web because of the fact that it allows us to do some very important JavaScript related work when we are as we're like building out our applications and whatnot. And so right now we kind of got to the point where we have this form kind of structured, right? We have it, we have the form basically labeled with inputs that we can receive some values in, right? And we want to be able to see what happens if we can, how we can pass that data back, right? So first, I want to just continue to talk about the form element and just remind you that what we're talking about here is also just the HTML form tag. So if you were trying to get more information on this, you could look up HTML forms and just kind of read through the different elements that are a part of a form. The two most important ones that we're using right now are the input and the label, which are what you use to define the visual kind of entry for the form. Each input has the opportunity to define an attribute called type. And this attribute, so in HTML, we call any little piece of information that we pass inside of a tag an attribute. In React and JSX, it's the same, right? We call these things attributes, except if we define them ourselves. Like if we're defining this attribute ourselves, right? That's when it becomes a prop, right? So prop is like almost like an attribute that you can create and define the data for and use JavaScript there. But attributes are kind of pre-built into the JSX component, right? And you would know what attributes are pre-built if you looked at the HTML elements and the specific attributes that are there. And so with the input component, there's a lot of different attributes that are already predefined. But the most important one is definitely the type, which will change what type of input you have in your, what type of input you have really that you're using, right? And so we are using the type text, which basically means that this input is going to receive some text. The labels are pretty self-explanatory. They're just labels. They label whatever is whatever element it's next to. So this label is style is for this. This label is for this. You can also even further specify those things as well. And then we have this submit button. So just like before, when we were talking about the button and like the idea that certain elements have specific values that they return, right? Similar stuff comes back when it comes to us thinking about forms and like the data points inside of forms. So a form element has a specific set of like, you know, visual elements that you can use, but then you can also do very event driven things with forms as well. So with a form, right, there's a couple different events that you might want to know about existing on a form, right? You know, one of the most important ones is on submit, which is a script that gets fired whenever a form is submitted. This is a default kind of event that happens in forms that is triggered by any input with the type submit. So if you have a button, if you use the input type submit, it's going to, by nature of the form, it's going to fire off whatever you define for the form in on submit. And so on submit is a specific event attribute that you can use to define what happens when this form is submitted. So for instance, what I might want to do is for now, right? So with event attributes, you have to pass a function for it to call, like an event handler. So we always, like for the most part, use pass functions. You can pass functions anonymously like this in JavaScript, just passing like an empty function, like or like a not defined function. You could also define the function, right? And say like something like let my func, and then you know, define the function here, right? I could do something like this, and then instead of having to put this function here, then I could just do something like that, right? But like just because like you'll see it also in kind of the practice, sometimes you'll see people define the functions in line and kind of just put what they want that function to do. And so in this case, just for right now, I'm going to put a just an alert, and I want to say the form was submitted, and let's see if this gets called when we press the submit button. Yeah, boom, this form was submitted. And we are also seeing that the browser is like refreshing, right? So I'm gonna type some stuff here. Let's say August, and then when I submit, something happens, and then the form gets kind of cleared, right? So what are we gonna need to do in order to process this to get some of that information back, and to make sure that we can do something with this form, right? We're gonna wanna do some interesting stuff with this to kind of pass this data back to this table. And so essentially, the first thing we wanna do is let's make our on submit a little bit more comprehensive, I should say. So first thing I wanna do is I want to make sure that this on submit is getting some of the data back, right? And so anytime we're using an event attribute, right, whether it's on a form, whether it's on a button, whether it's on just the div, it doesn't matter. Anytime we use any of these events, right, that are being handled, the script fires, but it also sends data every time it fires. And it sends data in a format that our function can receive as that our function can receive and manipulate. You just have to pass that as a parameter to your function. So normally we call this object that gets passed with event, and then you can see that you can see what that event passes back whenever you kind of are calling for something. So let me just open the console. And this, you might remember this from when we did our little tic-tac-toe example, but whenever I submit this form, right? Whenever I submit this form, oh, well, you see it real quick and then it kind of goes away because of the fact that the form's reloading. But there's a quick second that you'll see flash right here, some object that we're going to take a deeper look into. And that's the event object. The event object is a specific object in JavaScript that comes back from the DOM when it's processing an HTML event. So one of the things that you can do is to prevent the window from reloading every time that the form gets submitted, because we want to actually log some of that data. So first thing I'm going to do just to stop that is use this event and just say event prevent default, which is a function that runs that prevents the window from reloading after the once this thing gets submitted. So let's try this one more time and boom. So I press submit. We got this event to pull up and now we can actually inspect it a little bit more. So you might remember something that looked like this when we were looking at the tic-tac-toe game, right? And like one of the most important functions that are attributes, properties, I guess, that comes back from the event is the target. The target will always let you know what triggered this event. So clearly the target here is the form, right? And so we can use these event and the target attributes to know, okay, cool, which form triggered this event, and do very specific logical things there. But so one of the things that we might want to care about is, well, how can we get the value? How can we get the value from this input, right? What's the best way for me to get the value of this input to be able to use it later, right? Well, right now, we don't really store this value anywhere, right? There's no variable that I can set this to, but I want this data that's going to be updating over time to be stored somewhere, right? This might be a good opportunity for me to use state, right? Because now I can have the data in this component update and save that data somewhere that I can use later to update the component over time, right? And so, because like I was telling y'all, I want to kind of stay consistent in showing y'all how state works. I'm going to actually say, okay, cool. We recognize that we want to use state. So maybe what I might want to do is make this function that I started off with, I started off with this functional component. Maybe I want to actually make this a class-based component so I can make the state a little bit easier, right? So first I got to import React from React. And then I just want to change this to a function or to a class, excuse me. Just by adding some of the boilerplate logic there. And then because it's not that bad, all I have to do is add a render function around this return. I can keep all of that code there that we already wrote. And just to give this a little bit of space. Cool. So this is our new little class component. I'm gonna just tab this over. Great. And it's gonna work the same way, right? The only thing now is, okay, how do I want to make this happen so that on top of it now just being a class, I can use state, right? Well, using state in a class-based component, I can bring in the constructor, and inside of the constructor, one thing that we like to do, just as a rule of thumb, is just initialize the component with props, and then I can just kind of create my state, right? And so what might my state be, right? I might want some state to keep track of the values that are inside of these different inputs, right? Inside of this one for the month, inside of this one for the amount. So I could do that by maybe just giving these a very specific data point. So month is going to be some string, and key value pairs. Month is a key, string is value, and then amount is going to be the same. And I need a comma to separate these two values. So now I have some initialized, I have initialized month and amount at just an empty string. Well, that's great. Next thing I might want to do is figure out how can I have it be the case that whenever this input itself is being written into, so whenever I'm writing into this, I can update that value in the state so that I can save it for later. So I can use this value later, right? Well, there's just, in these moments, you might be thinking like, okay, well, what can the input do for me in order to let me get back some data, right? So the first thing I might want to do is just look up the input element and just think to myself like, okay, well, let's see what this input element really can do. And if you're using the W3 schools as a reference, depending on what other platforms you're using as a reference for yourself, it'll be depending on what you're using. You're going to have to look for different kind of signs of this. But the W3 schools is really great in that whenever you read about an element, right? And here we're reading about the input element. It will tell you when, it'll tell you some of the attributes that you can use, right, for the input. But then also, it will also tell you if this input or which tag, if it supports event attributes in HTML. And if any of the elements you look at support event attributes, that means you can use most of these different attributes event-wise to like trigger something. So we might care mostly about the form events in this case. We want to see what events happen on forms. Well, any element on the form that subscribes to HTML events can be triggering these types of events. It says it applies to almost all HTML elements, but it is most used in forms. Well, let's take a look at some of these. We saw the unsubmit, fire when a form is submitted. Okay. On select, fire after some text has been selected. On input, script to be run when an element gets user input. Okay. That sounds kind of interesting. And then on change, fires the moment when the value of the element is changed, right? So you might be thinking, well, let's use on input, right? And I'll tell you, you could try and definitely try if you want to use it. I'm gonna be completely honest and say like I've never really used the on input attribute in that regard. But the one that we're gonna use is we're gonna use the on change attribute to just make sure that whenever the input is getting changed, we can log that and update it as it's getting changed. So the any HTML events can be called in React and JavaScript by way of adding that specific event to the as an attribute to our JSX, just like we did with the onSubmit. So I might want to add some event handlers to these different inputs. So for this first input that we have technically for the month, right? We don't really have too much information about it there. But what I want to do first is and I'll just, because I just saw this, another good way for you to tell what like event attributes you can use on a specific JSX element, if you just type on, VS Code will give you a bunch of the options that you might want to choose from, right? And so, you could also use this as just a quick shortcut to see which different events might I want to use, and then go research it that way. But long story short, we're going to use the on change, right? And so all we got to do now is make sure we pass some function in here for this particular input to use, right? And to save the data in the state. So on change, right? Just like on submit, takes in a function. And so we just saw the example of, like I was saying, sometimes we do functions in line like this. But like I was saying before, there are definitely times where you might want to write a function out and pass that function in just to make yourself save a little bit of space or make your code a little bit cleaner for somebody that's reading. In that case, right, we talked about it from a function component context, right? It's very simple to add other functions to a functional component. But also in a class-based component, you can add functions. The syntax is a little different too. So in a class-based component, you can define functions all types of ways. But the way that I recommend that you do it is just using arrow functions. So let's just create a new arrow function, and I'm gonna say, I'm gonna say the name of the function. So in this case, we're going to say handle change, and I'm gonna set it equal to a arrow function, right? So just note that at first I was almost about to write like let in here, but in a class, it doesn't, you don't use the variable keywords inside of a class for functions like this. Variables would have been defined in a constructor or externally, but when you're defining functions that are going to be a part of the class, you just write the name of the function. So arrow functions are going to be really helpful if you're using class-based components, because they will help you with a specific thing that happens in classes, where just like we see we have to use the this.state everywhere. Sometimes with functions in classes, if you think about it, in a class, there are instance functions and there's class-based functions. And so in order to make your class aware of your the like instance functions you're creating, you need to do a process called binding the function. But if you use arrow functions, you don't have to do any of that. So it makes your life a lot easier because you don't even have to really worry too much if you commit to just using arrow functions. So that's one of the reasons why earlier I told y'all I just use arrow functions a lot, because of the fact that out of the box, it gives you some functionality that will help you with other things and doesn't really take away from anything else if you use arrow functions. So here I just have this handle change function. Inside, let's just console log, and let's put back the event. So, just any event function will bring back an event object. So let's just say on change, and we'll call this function that we already wrote. So in a class, remember I said in classes, if we want to call state, we use this.state. If we want to call props, we call this.props. If we want to call a function that we wrote as an instance function, we have to call this with the name of the function. So this.handle change is the name of that function. So I'm gonna just put that in there. And yeah, it kind of can get a little tedious to think about this whole this dot blah 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 stuff, but that's just what kind of comes with the territory of writing class-based components. But yeah, so now we have this on change wired up, and we have the handle change kind of set up. So now we should be able to console log event, and let's take a look at what comes back as we start typing in the month column. So boom. So clearly this is getting fired every time I'm typing, right? Inside of this event, we see that we know that the target of this is this particular input, and then inside of the target, we see some other stuff inside of here that is this value. So event.target has a property called value that actually is giving us, keeping us updated with the data inside of our target. So value here is now August, right? So clearly there's a property of the target that we can use to keep track of the value. And that's exactly what we're going to use. So I'm going to console log event.target.value instead of just event.target. And the event.target.value is going to help us use the event to keep a record of the value that is being passed with this particular piece of data, right? So now that the event.target.value is being logged, right, and I have this data here, well, cool. Like you might be thinking, well, if the event.target.value is has the data inside of it, why couldn't we just use this event.target.value to send that data back to the table. Well, the long and short of it is, when do you know that the event.target.value is done being written to, right? Technically, we won't know until the submit happens. But when we call submit, the event that we're looking at is a completely different event. We're not going to have this .target.value to look at. We're going to be looking at the event for the form, right? And that forms event wasn't giving us, right? If I submit the form one more time, right? This event has a completely different target that doesn't have no value. You know what I'm saying? So there's other ways that you can use the form data to try to grab it, but at the same time, it's like kind of a thing where it's like you don't necessarily know until that event is submitted what the data is necessarily going to be. So it might be a better idea to keep track of the data for the event, for the input, somewhere else that we can just have a more stable record of, to know that what the data is supposed to be whenever somebody ends up finally submitting. So in that vein, right, that's why we kind of created the state. So we can use the state to just be a store of the value and keep a record of it over time. So in that sense, right, we have the handle change working. It's kind of console logging the event.target.value. Well, the only thing now that we want to do is make sure that for the month, you know what I'm saying? We want this month value to also update. So I want not only to just console.log this, but I want to set the state, right? This .set state, and make sure that the month is getting updated with event.target.value, right? And that way, then the month is always going to have the most up-to-date version of whatever was in that form. So it'll be easier for us to just call this .state.month. We don't need to worry about using events to find the data. We can call the data wherever we want, especially inside of our other UI. So that's why the state is going to be important. So in that sense, now we have this data being kind of written to. We see that coming back from the form. So I'm going to just comment out this event.target.value. And what I want to do now is, when we submit the form, let's just take a look at the instead of console logging the event, let's console log this .state. And so now I'm gonna type August and submit, and there we go. Whenever I submit, now I have this really dope object that has the month in there, as up to date as it is whenever we submit, right? And the amount, but the amount is empty right now from this .state. So now we might want to do the same thing for the amount, right? So I might want to do like, okay, well, for this input, like we did before, I might want to have an on change. And, I also might want to handle the change. And definitely I want to do the same thing and set the state. But now this is kind of interesting, right? Like, well, if I use handle change, well, handle change is already kind of doing something specific with set state to the month, right? And using the event.target.value. I want to do a similar thing, but not for this handle change, but for this other one, right? So you can choose. There's some other workarounds that you might find are a little more elegant, where you can use one event handler function to target the different inputs that you have. But for the sake of just making it simple, right, I'm just gonna change these names. I'm gonna say this .handle month change, this .handle amount change, right? And then I just gotta change these functions here. I can make a new function, handle amount, and then basically change this amount to be basically a new, so the state is being set for the amount, and handle amount change is dealing with this amount, and handle month change is dealing with this month. And that is how helpful because we can now, as we can see, if we are, once we now type in August and some amount, right, and submit, we're gonna have that data come back as a very easy to use format, right, which is just object here. So the state is going to be really helpful so that we can keep track of this data that's changing over time in this form. And then we are now in a place where, okay, well now, like, what if now we want to use that data and send it back to our form or send it back to our table in a unique way? Well, that is that's the next level of questions that we're gonna get into as it relates to some of the topics we've been talking about, right? So think about it like this: we just did one piece of this bigger app, right? So this app has a couple different components to it. It has this H1, has a table, and it has the form. The table is responsible for showing the data. The form clearly is responsible for processing user input and taking that input, is just processing the user input, right? Now, when we submit, we have a, now when we submit the form, like this on submit function here, which maybe might be better to just kind of tease out. So I'm gonna just make this its own arrow function. That's easier to see. Right, so this handle submit function, all we're doing right now is console logging the state. So we know we have this data object, right? But at the same time, you know, what we might want to figure out how to do now is, how can I get this object that is being kind of recorded here with the month and the amount, right? Month and amount. How can I get that object to get passed to our table, right? So that the table can use it in the data, right? Well, we know that the data for the table is stored right now in the app.js in this big array, right? And this array has all of those other kind of month, and I guess I should call it savings instead of amount. So let me actually go back in here and let's say savings, so that it's consistent with our other thing. Savings. So how would I go about, how would I go about making sure that this object that we're getting back from the handle submit is going to be able to be passed to the table? Well, I got to figure out a way for it to add itself to this data in the table, in this table data, right? Because if I can get this data in the table to update, right, well, then the data in this table is going to update with another row, right? And that row is going to allow me to update this this table component. This is a pretty interesting scenario where we want to pass the data from the form. The form gets this data. We want to pass the data from one component, the form, to the table, right? But let me ask y'all a quick question to see if y'all been following and rocking with me these last few sessions. What do I need if I want to pass data from one component to another component? What do I use to do that?
Props.
Yes. Say it with your chest. Props. Right, exactly. You gotta use props. So technically, the only way, like I was telling y'all, the only way for me to pass the data from one component to another component is to use props. So technically, I need to find some way for this form to pass the data to the table as props. We already are passing the data to the table. We're already passing data to the table with regards to this prop, the data prop that we're passing already, right? This table data. So the question is more, how can I get this data from the form to go back to essentially support the, you know, add to the data that is going to eventually get passed to the table, right? So this is a pretty interesting conundrum, and definitely something worth racking our brains around and thinking a little bit deeper about how we can do this. But I want you to know that you now know everything you need to know in order to make that happen, right? The key here is going to be thinking a little bit more nuanced about how props work and how we can use props to communicate from component to component. Because essentially what you got to figure out is, how can I get one component, the form, to talk to this parent component, the app, that is responsible for passing the data to the table, right? Well, the app is also a parent component of our form. So there is a way for the form to talk to the app, right? We got to use props. But what we want to do here is something a little bit more sophisticated, wherein our form is going to communicate with our app when the form is ready to submit, right? Because now that the form has kind of, you know, hey, we got some state, I have some state here. Maybe what I want to do is let the app know and pass this data, right? And in that way, what the app could do is, oh, okay, cool, the form has some data. Let me take that data and then add it to my little table and add it to this table data. And after I add it to the table data, right, I'm gonna want to be able to pass that eventually to the table, right? But there's a couple different pieces to this that we have to think about. One is, how can I make it so that the data in here is actually able to be updated over time? Well, data changing over time, well, that sounds like state, right? And passing the data, well, that sounds like props. So we're gonna need to think a little bit more about how we're gonna use props and how we're gonna use data in order to make this all possible, right? And so that, my lovely friends, is really where the whole work of passing data around in React kind of becomes a little bit more realistic, where you have different components that are responsible for different things. They might need to communicate to each other and pass data in a way that will allow the entire application to change over time, because the data in one component is impacting the data in another component. And this is a very common scenario that comes up often in the React context. But like I said, now knowing about state, right? We understand that by using the state, we were able to keep track of this data from the form. And we're now able to say, hey, we have some data ready to go. We also learned that with the props, we can pass props from component to component to create this kind of data transfer flow, right? So we know we can pass data from the app to the table, but also we can pass data from the app to the form, or have the form send data back. And the nuance to that is a little interesting, but definitely something that's going to be really cool for us to learn about and continue to talk about. But yeah, I'm gonna pause on this right here, and yeah, we're gonna get deeper into this in our next session for sure. So yeah, I appreciate y'all.